I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like. What's up, world? Welcome to another edition of I Mix What I Like. I Mix What I Like.org, at I Mix What I Like for all your relevant social media. Again, I'm Jared Ball, happy to be your host. In this edition, we sat down once again with the legendary author, journalist, and university professor, Herb Boyd, to talk with him about his latest book, Black Detroit, A People's History of Self-Determination. We had a wide-ranging conversation about the history, the politics, the militancy described in Boyd's work. And then we also got a chance to talk with him about his new book in the context of and juxtaposed to the new Hollywood release, Detroit. So there was a lot we got into, a lot more to get into, so let's get to it right away. Thanks for joining us. Welcome to I Mix What I Like. So Herb Boyd, thank you again for joining us. It's always a pleasure to catch up with you. And very much excited to talk with you about your latest book. But again, welcome back to the program, Herb Boyd. Thanks again.
Oh, it's always a pleasure to be with you, Jared.
So there's a lot I want to get to with you in this conversation, but let me just have you first, if you would, in your own words, summarize for us a little bit about your new book, Black Detroit.
Well, one of the things about this, and in fact, I just got off doing an interview with a young journalist from Chicago, and he's working on a similar kind of project in terms of looking at the Black experience, looking at Chicago's history from a Black perspective, uh, focus, focusing primarily, Jared, on the music that come out of Chicago, more contemporary than going back to the blues days and everything. So we were having this conversation going back and forth, and I was giving him the kind of background that I've discovered about Detroit's music history, which is probably as long as any other narrative thread you want to follow out of that city from the lens, looking through a black lens at that city's history. And of course, looking at the music is always a good way to kind of summarize the experience of a people, because if anything that stays with them, it's almost like immutable. You can't erase that. It's kind of like boom, the spiritual drive and the essence of it, and the communication that they may have through their experiences is probably best captured in the music. And so, if you look at Black Detroit, of course, I do it much. I go beyond the music. I look at the politics, the kind of entrepreneurial, the sports, the literary, to say nothing of work of Black workers, because that's also essential in telling a people's story, is a kind of work endeavors. And of course, looking at the history of Detroit, we know in terms of the industrialization there that's characterized that city, that's been like a pivot, right in the crux of things, the epicenter, of the Black experience in Detroit. So it covers like 300 years, Jared. I go all the way back to the beginning, 1701, when this French explorer Cadillac, arrived, in the Straits. That's what Detroit means, this French word for straits, because of the river that runs between the United States and Canada. And he arrived there in 1701 and established Fort Pontchartrain. Eventually, it spread from there across the region. Later on, he's dead by 1730, and by some 6 years later, you have the introduction of slavery in a real way. A lot of people don't realize that slavery was in the city of Detroit. They figure like, oh, that's a southern experience. No, no, it was in the north, and even in New York here, where I live now. The slavery, they had more slaves here in New York than they had in Charleston, South Carolina at one point.
And I know you know a lot about it. I'm sorry to cut you. I didn't want to interrupt, but I know you know a lot about it. But I
Sure.
just had to throw in that line that, of course, as Malcolm X said, the real Mason Dixon line is the Canadian border. I mean, so slavery was,
Exactly.
a national
Take it a little bit
problem. It was
further
not.
north, and that's,
Anyway, please go
Jared, that
ahead. Yeah.
had to happen, but particularly after 1850, when you had the Fugitive Slave Act,
Right.
when they thought the fugitive slaves, the fugitive running away from bondage and from the plantation systems of the South, and they thought they'd reached Detroit, they'd reached the promised land, but uh-uh. You had to go a little bit further and do a little bit better. So that was across the Detroit River into Canada and sometimes as far away as up to Chatham, Ontario, which became a real settlement of abolitionists. And Detroit had a strong abolitionist movement too, and that's one of the things I focus on in the early chapters: the Blackburn Affair, the couple that had escaped from Louisville, Kentucky, and was at the center of the city's first real riot. And I say race riot in this to be very specific about it, because it was, black people were, really being attacked in so many different ways at that time. So, and then across the years, what I do in Black Detroit, it almost moves episodically. I find every 10 years or so, there's a major incident that's critical to the city's history and sometimes critical to the nation's history. And that's one of the discoveries I made in doing this research: how pivotal the city of Detroit has been in the American story, certainly from the standpoint of politics and economics and culture.
You know, well, actually, before we get too much farther than that, I mean, I wanted to ask you specifically, and maybe this is a perfect point of departure
Hmm.
for that, to say something separately about the suffix of the book's title, A People's History of Self-Determination, Black Detroit, A People's
Yes.
History of
Hmm.
Self-Determination. What does that phrase
Hmm.
mean for you, and how does that play out in the book? I mean, I do know in at least reading up on it that not only is the book 400 pages and very well researched, but it deals a
Hmm.
lot with the so-called common or regular person and those histories and stories as you tell this history of Black Detroit. But please, if you would, say a word or two about what you mean by a people's history of self-determination.
That's a very good question, because I had to come up with, you can say just Black Detroit, but then it has to have a little bit more resonance. And I thought that, well, one of the things that seemed to be particularly consistent about the Black experience in the city was the obstacles placed in front of the people. Just a few minutes ago, we talked about the whole slavery question. Well, that's the first particular challenge that the black the black Detroiters face. How to get over that particular circumstance, which of course was always, no matter where it was in this country, was a very, very horrendous one, and met with all kind of death and disaster. So that's the first challenge, and once you get over that one, then you run into the dawn of the 20th century and some of the concerns and issues that they face, even in the 1920s when Henry Ford made his $5 a day offer and attracted like a flood of workers. These migrants that came into the city at that time, created social welfare situations. The whole stimulus and the model for the National Urban League, it gained its traction in the city of Detroit. Detroit was like the model city, and because it was like fraught with all of those issues that later on that would be consistent with the National Urban League from city to city, where you had concentrations of African American people who were faced with housing and job and just general survival issues, where the Urban League had to step in. So in the 1920s, you met with the whole question of restricted covenants, in which the African American community was confined, constricted into like part, we called it Black Bottom or Paradise Valley back then. So then you met with the challenge of how do you survive, given this kind of incipient racism that existed in Detroit in the 1920s. You might get a job at Ford, but it would be probably the most hazardous, the most dangerous, and the lowest paying job that the company offered. But even that, was better than sharecropping in Alabama. And you have to understand that Alabama was kind of the central pipeline for these migrants that was coming out of the South, kind of a straight line ascendant, straight line migration from Alabama to Detroit. And my mother, who brought my brother and me to Detroit, followed a similar trail, coming straight up from out of Tuskegee and Birmingham straight to Detroit. And that's 1941. And I arrived in 1943, a couple of months before the race riot that ripped that city apart. So what I do in the book then is look at these particular issues, whether it's race, whether it's segregation or discrimination, whether it's job opportunities and housing conflict. All of those things, impacted the black community in such a way that it had to struggle to overcome. So the self-determination is about dealing with those challenges, no matter how it was coming at them, whether it was like on the athletic field, whether it was in the educational institutions, whether it was in cultural associations or entrepreneurial things, because the same kind of situations that faced black people in the South, followed them right into the North. So they figured that, oh, we made it to the promised land, but it's not very promising up here. When you look at the job opportunities and the housing situation, 1925, you had the O.C. and Sweet case where this doctor moved in, this black doctor moved into the east side of Detroit, an all-white neighborhood, and was met with all kind of hostility. White mob that gathered outside and stoned his house. And so, but fortunately, he and his family, they had taken some arms and to protect themselves, and so, as a consequence of the turmoil there, a white person was killed, and that led to the whole Sweet trials, in which Clarence Darrow, the great attorney of the damned, arrived in Detroit to represent the family, and got him acquitted after some duration. But of course, the impact of that, it left its mark on the family. Dr. Sweet lost Gladys, his wife. He lost a child, and ultimately by 1960 he took his own life. So some of the residue out of that situation kind of like stays with you for years. And so we have those individual struggles. I talk about a William Lambert, and the famed abolitionist George D. Baptiste, Madison Lightfoot, the first African American teacher in Detroit, Fannie Richards, and what she had to do to break down the walls of discrimination that existed in the school system here in Detroit, right on down to the Pelham family, outstanding Pelham family that founded the first significant African American newspaper, the Detroit Plain Dealer. And of course, the family for generations would be the movers and shakers among the black elite. So I have the black elite there, but for the most part, you're absolutely right, Jared. I look at the black working class right on down to their involvement in the labor and the union movement. And they were very formidable there. And we have some outstanding individuals, freedom fighters inside of the labor movement, probably none more notable than Coleman Young, who later, by 1974, becomes the first African American mayor, and he holds that post longer than any other mayor in the history of the city of Detroit for some 20 years, down to 1994. He died in 1997, and he left behind a legacy that if you go to Detroit, you'll see. I mean, the first thing that hits your eye is a Renaissance Center, and that's the downtown development, because he was the ultimate deal maker. He got the major corporations to kind of give it up so he could build up downtown with the idea that that particular kind of energy would spread to Midtown and beyond. Well, he didn't live long enough or was not in office long enough to realize that particular dream, but that's something now we see happening with Detroit being called a comeback city after the '67 rebellion. Of course, a lot of celebration, a lot of anniversary around that particular moment, even the film that's out there called Detroit.
Yeah, and I want us to talk a little bit about that film
Sure.
as I'll get to in a minute, maybe unfortunately juxtapose that film with what you're doing with your book. But there's one thing I did want to quickly ask you about, because in preparation for our interview, and I would encourage others who see our conversation to follow up for a more in-depth and extensive conversation with you and about your book on C-SPAN TV with Professor Rita Kiki Edozie, who had a great and winding, fascinating conversation with you about all of this. One piece I did want to pick up from what she said, though, if you could just touch on for a quick moment, because obviously it is a personal issue for me. But you talk a little bit in your book about academics, academia, black
Hmm.
academia, particularly there at Wayne State University.
Oh,
And
brother.
a lot of what people hear about academia, particularly black academia, is either popular television punditry or the so-called disassociated detached ivory tower scholar. And I think what
Hmm.
you were doing in your book adds a little bit of more complicated context to that history, particularly as it pertains to black academia, and specifically, obviously, there in Detroit. But could you talk a little bit about what you did there with that?
One of the things about, you look at that particular perspective, in terms of the Wayne State University, understand that it's located, right in the heart of the African American community. But, for many years up until the rebellion, you had a scarcity of African Americans on campus. Though we could walk in and around the place, we're not invited on it. So the 67 rebellion gave us some leverage. I'm talking about the few students who were there at that time. And I had arrived there in 1965, after leaving Dodge, Maine, where I'd worked in the factories. And, Malcolm is dead by that time, has been killed. So my whole life and trajectory, it was turned it around completely because I had every intention to join him in New York, where I, uh, before his assassination and everything. So I set aside that particular dream and followed his whole motto of like studying history. So I went to Wayne State University.
And
So I was
if I
there
could
from
interrupt
six.
you one more time, forgive me, but I did want to would
Sure.
want to remind our audience that they can go to imixwhatilike.org and hear our previous interviews with you, particularly about your work with Malcolm X. Where they can hear much more about your experience and that
Exactly.
work. But anyway, please go ahead. Sorry.
Hmm. Oh yeah, that's exactly true. The other thing though is that Malcolm was like my role model. He was my mentor, my big brother, and so I just wanted to live up to some of the kind of legacy he left behind because he was a man of his word. I mean, after his house had been firebombed and everything, he still came to Detroit, kept his promise, lived up to that particular obligation, and spoke at Ford Auditorium. I missed it because I just felt, his house being firebombed as it was, he was not going to make it to Detroit. But Malcolm was a man of his word. But once he was gone, the only way I feel that I could live up to and represent, what he stood for was to go down there and educate myself. And so by 67, when it exploded, I had been at Wayne State University 2 years by then and had joined a number of other activists on the campus. And so we realized that we had a powder keg. We had a piece of dynamite in our hands in terms of turning that campus around, turning that university around, and hold it hostage because it was just trembling with the prospect that the rebellion that had just kind of tamped down a month before, because if you move into classes starting again in September, well, through the whole month of August, it was simmering discontent in the city. And we had a people's tribunal as a result of the rebellion. A lot of people don't talk about that, but that's a significant development in terms of how the African American community, and talk about self determination, began to organize itself. And it led to these other formations like the Shrine of the Black Madonna or the Republic of New Africa, the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, all of those things. And also kind of revived even the Nation of Islam at that time, who that started in the city of Detroit back in the 1920s when Elijah Poole became Elijah Muhammad and was hooked up with W.D. Favre. That's another story I tell in Black Detroit. But anyway, back to the academy. Okay, you got the students there. We're now armed with the specter, of the rebellion, and the administration was trembling in its boots, conceded all of the demands we made, Jared, in terms of like a Black Studies program, Association of Black Students, an increase of African American student enrollment on campus, along with remedial and tutorial help and blah blah blah. So all of those demands that we made, we realized that, you know we had an advantage, the leverage, of the rebellion. And so when we made all these
And a
demands to
national
put together
movement. I
black,
mean, Black Studies was itself a national
yeah,
movement. This was happening all over the country. So
all over the country,
both the
San
rebellions in the
Francisco
streets
State.
and the takeovers of the
Hmm.
campuses. Yeah. Anyway. Yeah.
Exactly. So that was a general tenor of things at that time. And so we just took that, and once we opened the doors up, it provided a number of African American students who heretofore could not get into the campus doors. So now, some of the workers, for example, that I worked with at Dodge, Maine, became students on campus. I helped facilitate that movement. So then you had the student newspaper. We took over that. The Inner City Voice had already been created, outside of the campus, but far more militant, purpose and mission to it. So we had these individuals who are now a part of the labor struggle, now at campus. So it was a hookup. We brought the academy, then was linked, to the grassroots, and that was always my position, to have one foot on campus and one foot out in the community. And how can you bring these two things together? So I was in a good place at that time, and eventually and a year later, I was teaching there and stayed around teaching for 12 years on campus and was able to bring a number of community organization into play because I was going back and forth, whether it was music or literature. You had Broadside Press that had been created by Dudley Randall. You had, of course, Barry Gordy had already set the whole music machine, the whole soundtrack of a generation that had been set in motion. But the jazz elements and the blues elements, and that was kind of only what you call ancillary to what Barry was doing with the rhythm and blues. With kind of pop music and the very commercial, investment that he made. So we had a number of other very significant musicians who some of them participated in the studios. Earl Van Dyke, for example, and the Funk Brothers, but they were essentially jazz musicians. The Yusef Lateef, the Marcus Belgraves, a number of guitar, Kenny Burrell. Those individuals were a part of the jazz community that found opportunities inside of Berry Gordy's Motown records and what have you. So you had this here kind of confluence that was going on from a cultural standpoint and how that kind of connected up with the political activism, the whole literary developments that was going on, the poets that came into existence at that time, who hooked up with the international thing that was going on too, because Detroit had that kind of image that was cast all over the world. So people like Harry Haywood would come to town, and we worked with him on his book, The Black Bolshevik. That a James Foreman could end up there with the Black Manifesto, and the whole Bed Sea, and making demands on the churches in this country to give up the reparations money. And of course, that kind of was funded some of the other activism that came out of the League of Revolutionary Black Workers. So there were some very unique developments at that time, but most of it spinning around the militancy, the kind of activism that grew on Wayne State University's campus at that time. It was like a hot spot, just like Madison up in Madison, Wisconsin. They used to talk about the University of Wisconsin at Madison being a hotbed of activism, or the Berkeley or Howard University. Well, we had it right there at Wayne State University too, and I think it was a kind of a mutual cross pollination was going on from maybe a Cornell where the students had taken over at Cornell, or what the students at Howard University was saying, and at some point we were moving around and went all the way out with Jimmy Garrett and Nathan Hare and those individuals at San Francisco State, Sarah Webster Fabio. We hooked up with them and got some ideas on how to improve and intensify our struggle, in Detroit. And at the same time, they learned from us because, in terms of the most advanced workers, advanced activists at that time, you had to go a long way to get past the league because you had some very, very prominent individuals there who grew out of the labor movement, who came out of the legal professions, who were part of the whole history of socialism and communism in the city of Detroit.
So that is we didn't rehearse this, but that is a beautifully laid out portrait and frame and transition or segue into the conversation I want to have a little bit about this film Detroit,
Mm-hmm.
because I watched the film Detroit, and reading about your book, hearing you talk about your book, knowing about the history and legacy of your work in particular, at least a little bit, I was immediately struck by what is missing in the film. And I want to start, if I can, by reading a little excerpt of a review that kind of speaks exactly to what I'm getting at. And then I definitely want to hear what you think about the film and as it relates to what you've done in your research and your lived experience. But it's a review in RogerEbert.com from Angelica Jade Bastien. And I did reach out to her to see if we could get her to join us, but we weren't able to make that happen, at least yet.
Okay.
But she starts off, she said that her first line says that watching Detroit, the latest film directed by Catherine Bigelow and penned by Mark Boal, or Boal, I'm not sure how it's pronounced, I hit a breaking point I didn't realize I had. I was disturbed so deeply by what I witnessed that I left the theater afterwards in tears. It wasn't the relentless violence inflicted upon black bodies or the fiery devastation of the riots ripping apart Detroit, but the emptiness behind the moments that got under my skin. Watching Detroit, I realized that I'm not interested in white perceptions of black pain. She says a few words about white filmmakers having the right, of course, to tell these stories, and then she gives a few examples where she thinks it was done better. But then she concludes, at least this line, I'll conclude here for now. And she says, Detroit was directed, written, produced, shot, and edited by white creatives who do not understand the weight of the images they hone in on with an unflinching gaze. And in some ways that summarizes the my negative response to the film, in that it felt to me just like another, like murder porn, as some have described it. Just more violence, more violence heaped upon black bodies, as this author says. More black pain, more black suffering. This attempt to balance black pain and black suffering with white fear, angst, and conflict over race and racism. And because so little has changed in real life since that incident, I mean, that incident happens all the time still to this day. It felt again that as I'm hearing some of the conversation where people are saying, well, now, we can have another chance to look at this history and reflect on American history and where we are today. It just sounds like another, again, the recycled, not only abuse, the lived material experience of abuse, but then the recycling of it and the financial and cultural benefit going to the very society that is heaping this upon black people in the first place. And none of the depth that you bring in your book or in your work to the black life and experience of Detroit, I felt is able to be brought into the film. Again, in part because we're only talking about black people in film in relationship to violence suffered by police in the state, without the militant organizing, without the politics, without the history and the culture that you're summarizing. So, all right, so I'll stop there and let you respond in any way you like and tell us what you think of the film.
Well, that's a good point, Jared, and good place to start any kind of rebuttal or embellish or compliment, what has already been said. And I've heard those particular perspectives, and many of them I share. I did a long review of the film that I published last week in the Michigan Chronicle. Matter of fact, they use it as an op-ed piece. I wanted it more as a film review critique. But anyway, it's in the paper, and I just responded yesterday to Michael Eric Dyson's piece. He had an op-ed piece in the New York Times yesterday, and I took exception to his kind of glorification of the film and his praise, just gets overzealous praise of Miss Bigelow and her ability to capture the black pain and violence and everything. And I concede in that point, but at the same time, what I think is really missing is black agency. black self-determination. And what happened at the end of the rebellion, we knew, the activists in the community, we knew that the cops would be acquitted. We're talking about the three black men they killed there at the Algiers Motel and Annex. We knew that they would be acquitted, and even more so when they had a change of venue and they moved it to Flint and to Mason, Michigan. So our response to that was, okay, we'll try these cops ourselves. That's when the People's Tribunal came into existence. That's something that has been missing in most of the discussion. I think Bigelow, she could have grabbed onto, instead of presenting the trial, which was a foregone conclusion because of the change of venue. That was, we knew that those cops would be acquitted. But I thought she could have, like, she missed an opportunity to talk about black agency, the black self determination, the response, the resistance, the history of struggle in our city. And so you had the tribunal, but there's no mention of that. She chose to focus on the trial, which was a waste of film footage as far as I'm concerned. If you want to talk about the reaction of the African American community, let's look at the tribunal. But it's not mentioned or contextualized in any way. We didn't expect it would be, because her focus was centered on, like, right at that very narrow element that developed the 5 days of hostility. She chose just a few minutes of that particular event to focus in on the black pain inside of the annex. So one of the things we said, that if that had been done, if she'd have focused on the tribunal or said anything at all about it, then she could have reached into black agency in terms of what black people did as a result of that, because that's going to be consequential, as I said earlier, because out of that people organized, povo organizado, the Portuguese talk about it, is that it was a stimulus that led to the Shrine of the Black Madonna, the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, the Republic of New Africa. All of these things grew out of, a sense of organizing ourselves. So if you wanted to get into black agency, she could have done that by giving some attention to the People's Tribunal, because rather than going to that trial thing. So the black woman was missing from all of this, and I've heard that particular discussion. She missed an opportunity there, maybe looking at the forensic or the autopsies that were conducted by a black woman. She missed the kind of reaction that came from, and also the kind of anachronisms that exist in the film. The Carl Cooper shooting the gun that many times. He only fired the gun one time. It was not that provocation that she seemed to suggest in the film that they may have reacted in a righteous way because of all the gunshots that was coming from out of the motel window. But that's ahistorical. That's not true. What she does with the dramatics in there, that's an anachronism and ahistorical too, because it was really, Martha and the Vandellas was performing at the Fox Theater, and she made the announcement that the concert was over because of the developing rebellion, in the city. So we can go on pointing out a number of inaccuracies and anachronisms in the film that don't hold true. But I think the critical thing is that we're going to have to make our own films a little bit more. We have to make them in such a way, Jared, that would be so exhaustive and would prohibit anyone else broaching into our accomplishments or our pain. We have to do that more and more from an artistic standpoint and a cultural standpoint, which of course, these white filmmakers and writers who have the wherewithal to come into and exploit and take advantage of. However, sometimes unwittingly doing a job for us, but at the same time, they capitalize off of that. We do not. So we have to find some kind of way. We have the resources. It's just that they're so misdirected. They're not focusing on things where we can have these interlopers, these intruders come in and take advantage of it. Where's the film on John Brown that would show the five black men that rode with him? Where's the film on Paul Robeson? We had one, recently with the whole the birth of a nation, but I was concerned there about some of the treatment and particularly the ending of that film, which was just absolutely farcical. But anyway, we need to do our own films a lot more so we can head off and stop these intruders from coming in and exploiting, capitalizing off of our culture, which is so dynamic and vibrant.
Well, unfortunately, I think that, and I won't bother you too much right now with my views on this. But unfortunately, for one, I agree that the Nate Parker film, the ending, was atrocious and belied the politics of the industry that would promote that film. And again, people can check out, we've had several conversations again at imixwhatilike.org. People can check that out. But essentially, I was just saying that the film was trying to say that violence in self-defense or defense of your community is only acceptable when you're wearing the uniform of the United States military. And that was what we were meant to see from, the little boy going from snitch to hero.
He did something. Wow. Which, of course, again, was ahistorical.
Well, right, of course. Yeah, never mind. Yeah, you're right.
That.
Yep. No, it didn't happen like that. Yeah, you're right. Never mind that. But so that was sort of be my point about in response to what you're saying about having to make our own films, that the politics involved in that is what the industry itself can't support, can't allow. So we would have to not only make our own films, but find alternative distribution methods for having those films being seen, because the conventional avenues wouldn't allow themselves. And to the point that I see, at least in some of the conversation, that of course, I mean, well, we have our crew has a long-standing struggle with Dyson, so I'm not surprised to hear he got this wrong as well. But even in his characterization, discussion of racial violence on screen, one of the things we never see in a Hollywood-supported film is violence from the revolutionary violence from the grassroots against the state in righteous self-defense. We don't even see that, by the way, and I'll just say this very quickly, we don't even see that, by the way, in terms of the history of Jews, who are supposed to and often said to run everything in Hollywood. Even the history of Jews coming from Hollywood does not recount, other than one film, where Jews defended themselves in armed struggle against the Nazis. For all the films we get about the Holocaust, we don't even get to see Jews, who again are supposed to at least nominally be in charge of Hollywood, in armed self-defense. So constructive revolutionary self-defensive violence is something that the industry as an institution can't allow consideration of. So that would be one of the major obstacles to having our history be told accurately. That's a major obstacle to Black history.
About that, Jared.
Yeah,
we got so much to do on that front in terms of not only from a corrective standpoint, but one that begins to take a proactive, in terms of Black agency. We can still do those kind of things. We're putting Black filmmakers out there. They put the film, they waste a lot of time and energy and resources, putting something out there that really has no resonance whatsoever in terms of our militancy or the kind of struggle that we have, the self-determination, the self-reliance, the self-assertion, the battle against oppression. We need to have that kind of thing transferred to our generation, from generation to generation, no doubt about it. So I agree with you wholeheartedly.
Well, one of those talented sisters and brothers, or a collective of those talented sisters and brothers, sees this interview or sees your other interviews and reads your book. They'll make it about your book with the basis. Black Detroit, a people's history of self-determination, could be the basis of a film that might get us pointed in the right direction. But Herb Boyd, thank you very much for your work and being willing to talk with us about it. Man. Thank you, man.
Beautiful.
Thanks again to Herb Boyd for joining us. Thanks to you for watching. Once again, make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel or link up with us at imixwhatilike.org or at imixwhatilike for all your relevant social media. Don't forget, we may be new to this YouTube game, but we're not new to media production. And at imixwhatilike.org, we have a deep reservoir for you to do a deep dive dig into. So enjoy, check it out. And as always, as Fred Hampton used to say, to you we say peace if you're willing to fight for it. So peace, everybody, and we'll catch you in the whirlwind. I mix what I like, what I like, what I like.